She walked into the room, believing it was just another Christmas party. She didn't know she had stepped into the world of a billionaire. He noticed her the moment she turned away from the crowd, not because she was trying to be seen, but because she wasn't. He was the man everyone feared, respected, obeyed. She was the woman who treated him like none of that mattered. One conversation, one choice. And suddenly, love wasn't just dangerous. It was powerful enough to destroy reputations, careers, even an empire. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a story about two strong souls who met in the wrong world, at the wrong time, and dared to choose each other anyway. Stay until the end, because the truth behind their love changes everything. The first thing that shattered the illusion was the sound of glass breaking. It came from somewhere behind the orchestra, sharp, brief, immediately swallowed by polite laughter and a violin's smooth recovery. No one stopped smiling. No one turned their head for more than a second at a Manhattan Christmas gala. Even accidents were trained to be discreet. The illusion held. It always did. Charles Blackwood arrived precisely on time, as he did with everything else in his life. His entrance required no announcement. It never had. Men straightened their shoulders when they noticed him. Women adjusted their smiles, recalibrated their posture, performed calculations he had grown used to ignoring. The black suit fit him perfectly, tailored to a body that carried authority without effort, and his expression remained neutral, unreadable. The way boards preferred their billionaires calm, controlled, immune to surprise. He accepted handshakes that felt like contracts. He exchanged greetings that contained more strategy than warmth. He listened to compliments delivered like currency. This was his terrain, mapped and memorized. Nothing here could touch him. Then he saw her. She wasn't where she was supposed to be. She stood near the balcony doors, half turned away from the room, a glass of red wine held loosely in her hand, as if she'd forgotten it was there. The city beyond the glass stretched and glittered, a second constellation competing with the chandeliers behind her. She wasn't watching the skyline, though. She was watching the people quietly, attentively, like someone studying a language she already understood, but didn't feel the need to speak. She wasn't wearing anything extravagant. No dramatic neckline. No desperate shimmer. Her dress was simple, elegant in a way that suggested intention rather than expense. Her hair fell naturally over her shoulders, dark and soft, framing a face that didn't ask to be admired. It simply existed. Charles felt the pause before he understood it, the slight hitch in his breath, the unfamiliar delay between seeing and categorizing. He didn't know who she was. That alone was unusual. His name circulated through rooms like this, long before he entered them. People prepared for him. They researched him. They rehearsed their reactions. Yet the woman by the balcony didn't look up when he arrived, didn't adjust her posture, didn't perform recognition a second too late. She stayed exactly as she was. Charles found himself moving toward her before he made a conscious decision to do so. No entourage followed. No assistant intercepted him. He abandoned a conversation mid-sentence, leaving behind a man who would pretend not to be offended. Up close. She smelled faintly of citrus and something warm he couldn't place. She turned when she sensed him, not startled, not eager, just present. "Is it always like this?" she asked, gesturing subtly toward the room, her voice calm, amused. Or is Christmas just particularly theatrical? He smiled before he could stop himself. It felt strange on his face. Only when people think they're being watched, he replied. She studied him, eyes sharp but kind, as if measuring truth rather than status. Then they're all performing for the wrong audience. Her words landed without flirtation, without challenge, just observation. They spoke easily after that, about the city, about silence, about the strange pressure of rooms filled with ambition, disguised as celebration. He told her his name was Charles, just Charles. She offered hers without hesitation, Louis. She didn't ask what he did, didn't ask who he knew. When he asked about her, she answered plainly her work, her interests. The way her voice softened when she spoke about ideas rather than people. She was intelligent, but not in a way that demanded acknowledgement. Her confidence was quiet, self-contained. Charles realized, slowly, that he was relaxing. The armor he wore so instinctively politeness sharpened into distance. Charm measured by return on investment was slipping. With her. He didn't have to maintain the balance between approachability and authority. He could simply exist. It unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had. Time moved strangely around them. The orchestra swelled and softened. Laughter rose and fell. At some point, someone called his name from across the room. He ignored it. Louis noticed but said nothing. "You should go," she said eventually, glancing at her watch. Not regretful, not apologetic, just honest. "They're looking for you." He followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "You're leaving." She nodded. "I don't belong to nights like this." Something in her tone told him she didn't mean it as self-criticism. It was a statement of fact, a boundary. As she stepped away, he felt the instinct to stop her, an impulse sharpened by years of acquisition. If something mattered, he secured it. If something intrigued him, he claimed it. But this was different. She walked toward the exit without looking back. No lingering glance, no silent invitation. Charles remained where he was, the noise of the room rushing back into him, like a tide. For the first time that evening, the chandeliers felt too bright, the conversations too loud. It was only later, much later, alone in his car as the city slid past, that the realization struck him fully. Louis Johnson had spoken to him for nearly half an hour. She had laughed at his dry humor. She had disagreed with him once, gently, without fear. She had left without hesitation, and she had never once asked his last name. She didn't know who he was. The thought lingered, dangerous and intoxicating, for the first time in years. Charles Blackwood wanted something he couldn't buy, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he wanted to keep the truth from her just a little longer. Charles did not chase people. He acquired them, negotiated with them, outpaced them. Desire, in his world, was managed through leverage and timing. Yet Louis Johnson resisted all familiar strategies. She had left without leaving anything behind, no curiosity, no unfinished sentence he could hook into, only absence. And absence, he discovered, was intolerable. He found her the only way that made sense, without breaking the fragile truth she had unknowingly protected through her work. Louis was deep into a research project that sat at the uncomfortable intersection of innovation and funding scarcity. Brilliant ideas lived there, often suffocating under committees that spoke the language of caution. Charles knew the terrain well. He also knew how often support arrived with strings wrapped tightly around it. So he framed the invitation carefully. Neutral language. Clear objectives. A meeting to discuss potential collaboration between her research team and a private foundation. No last name beyond what she already knew. No titles. No theatrics. When Louis read the email, her first instinct was refusal. She recognized the tone immediately. Polite. Professional. Vague in the way power often was, when it wanted to appear harmless. She had seen it before, men with influence cloaking interest as opportunity, generosity as mentorship, curiosity as entitlement. She had learned to be careful without being closed. Still, she agreed to meet him, on her terms. They met in a quiet cafe near her office, a place chosen for its anonymity rather than convenience. No private room, no polished boardroom, just wood tables, worn smooth by years of conversations that mattered only to the people having them. Charles arrived first. He stood when she approached, a small gesture, instinctive. She noticed, noted it, then dismissed it. Courtesy was easy. Consistency was rare. She sat across from him, posture relaxed but alert, like someone who knew how quickly a pleasant conversation could turn into negotiation. "I want to be clear," she said before he could begin. "I'm not interested in being managed." Charles didn't smile. He nodded. "Neither am I." It wasn't the answer she expected. He explained the proposal without urgency. A foundation interested in supporting independent research. No demand for exclusivity. No timeline forced into existence. He spoke plainly, occasionally pausing to let her think, rather than filling the silence. When she challenged a point, he listened, really listened, then adjusted. Louis found herself disarmed, despite her caution. He didn't interrupt, didn't redirect her concerns into softer language. When she spoke about limitations, he didn't counter with solutions designed to make her dependent. He asked questions instead, precise ones, intelligent ones. She leaned back slightly, reassessing. "This sounds too reasonable," she said. "What's the catch? There isn't one," he replied. "Not yet. Anyway." Her eyes narrowed. "That's not reassuring. It's honest." They talked for over an hour. About methodology, about ethics, about the strange pressure placed on researchers to compromise clarity for funding. Charles never once referenced his own authority. He never said what he could make happen. He spoke only about what interested him and why her work did. When they stood to leave, Louis surprised herself by feeling reluctant. Before parting, they established an understanding, unspoken but firm. This would not be transactional in the way power preferred. No hidden expectations. No blurred lines disguised as opportunity. And above all, no lies. Charles agreed without hesitation. For days afterward, Louis replayed the meeting in her mind, searching for the fracture she was sure must exist. She found none. That unsettled her more than if she had. Their communication remained measured, professional, but warm. Emails that respected time. Conversations that deepened without pushing. She allowed herself to trust the rhythm, even as a voice in the back of her mind whispered caution. The fracture appeared quietly. It happened late one evening, long after the campus had emptied. Louis sat alone in her office, reviewing documentation for a grant renewal. Her eyes skimmed familiar names until one stopped her cold. Blackwood. Not Charles. Just the name. Attached to a foundation. Linked to a series of decisions that had shaped her project's trajectory months before she had ever met him. Her pulse slowed, then sharpened. She followed the trail carefully, cross-referencing without panic. The pattern emerged with brutal clarity. The funding streams, the approvals, the rejections that had redirected her work rather than ended it. All of it traced back to Blackwood Holdings, to him. The room felt suddenly smaller. Louis leaned back in her chair, fingers pressed against her temple. It wasn't that he had interfered maliciously. If anything, the decisions had protected her work. But protection without consent was still control. And omission, no matter how gentle, was still deception. She thought back to the cafe, to his measured tone, to the way he had listened, to the agreement they had never spoken aloud. No lies. She didn't confront him immediately. She waited, observed. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. She needed to understand whether this was strategy or coincidence, manipulation or restraint. When they met again days later, the atmosphere had shifted, though Charles didn't yet know why. Louis was warmer on the surface, sharper underneath. Her questions cut closer. Her pauses lingered. Finally, she asked, "Your foundation, who ultimately controls it?" Charles met her gaze. The moment stretched, thin as wire. "Why do you ask?" he said. "Because," she replied evenly, "I don't like discovering truths by accident." Something passed through his expression too quick to name, too controlled to read fully. He answered carefully, honestly, but not completely. "Not yet." Louis nodded, accepting the response while filing away what he hadn't said. As they parted, the city buzzing around them, a quiet tension settled between them. Not anger, not betrayal, uncertainty. Louis walked away with one question echoing in her mind, heavier than any accusation. If he had hidden this, what else had he chosen not to tell her? And for the first time since that night in Manhattan, she wondered whether the man she was beginning to trust had been standing behind a mask all along. Louis entered Charles's world gradually, not through spectacle but through access. It began with an invitation she almost declined, an open request to observe a board meeting, framed not as a privilege, but as transparency. She accepted after a pause that lasted longer than etiquette allowed. Part of her wanted to test him. Another part wanted to understand the machinery behind the man. The boardroom was glass and steel, perched high above the city like a throne carved from logic. People spoke in controlled voices, each sentence sharpened to justify its existence. Numbers filled the air, dense and unforgiving. Decisions were made not with emotion, but with precision that bordered on cruelty. Louis watched as projections shifted, as futures were approved or erased with a nod. Charles sat at the head of the table, composed, distant, decisive. This was the version of him the world knew, the man who did not hesitate, the man whose silence carried more weight than most people's arguments. She realized then that what unsettled her most was not his power, but how easily he bore it. Afterward, alone in the elevator as the city descended beneath them, the silence pressed close. Louis broke it without looking at him. "How do you live with that?" she asked. "Knowing every choice costs someone something." Charles's jaw tightened. Just slightly. "You don't live with it," he said. "You carry it." It was the first crack. Over the following weeks, she saw more. Early mornings that began before dawn. Nights that stretched until the city slept. Calls taken in quiet corners. Voices lowered, not out of secrecy but exhaustion. He never complained, never framed his burden as sacrifice. But Louis noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers stilled only when he wasn't being watched. One evening, long after a meeting that had ended badly, Charles didn't return to the office. He went to her instead. They sat in silence in her apartment, the city humming outside the windows. No agenda, no negotiation, just the soft ritual of shared space. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about the meeting. It was about control. "I'm afraid of losing it," he admitted quietly. "Not the company. Myself." She didn't respond right away. She moved closer. Not touching, just present. "You don't have to be in command every second," she said. "Not here." Something in him loosened. From that night on, their connection deepened in ways neither of them named. Evenings became quieter. Conversations stretched, unguarded. They spoke of childhood in fragments, of expectations inherited before consent was possible. Charles revealed pieces of his past, not as confession, but as context. Louis listened without judgment, without trying to fix what wasn't broken. For the first time in years, Charles slept without setting an alarm. It was Louis who noticed the shift first. The woman appeared at a fundraiser, stepping into the room with the ease of someone who had never needed an invitation. She was elegant, precise, her smile sharp enough to cut through glass. When she greeted Charles, it was with familiarity that bordered on possession. Her hand lingered on his arm, a fraction too long. Charles stiffened. Louis observed quietly, instinct sharpening. The woman's gaze flicked toward her, calculating, dismissive. Not curiosity, recognition. Later, alone near the balcony, the woman approached. "You must be Louis," she said. Her tone smooth. "I'm Evelyn." No last name. None was needed. "I've known Charles a very long time," Evelyn continued, eyes never leaving Louis's face. Long before he learned how to hide his weaknesses. Louis held her gaze. "Everyone has weaknesses." Evelyn smiled. "Yes, but not everyone survives them." The warning hung in the air, elegant and lethal. That night, Louis felt the edge of something she couldn't yet name. Not jealousy, not fear, something colder, strategic. She watched Charles from across the room, saw the way his attention remained anchored to her, even as Evelyn spoke to others. But she also saw the tension he carried, the history that had not loosened its grip. Later, when she asked him about Evelyn, his answer was measured, careful. "Someone from my past," he said. "Someone who should have stayed there." It wasn't enough. Louis didn't press, She had learned the value of patience. But as she left that night, the city lights blurring beneath her, a certainty settled deep in her chest. The world Charles inhabited was not done testing him, and if she stayed, it would test her too. For the first time since meeting him, Louis wondered not whether she could trust Charles, but whether she could survive the truths still buried beneath his billions. The first headline didn't use her name. It never did at first. It called her a mystery woman, a new presence, a quiet constant beside one of the most powerful men in Manhattan. The photograph was taken from across the street, grainy but intimate enough to suggest intent. Louis recognized the angle immediately, the way the city framed her as an accessory rather than a person. She closed the article without finishing it. By the third mention, her name appeared, misspelled once, corrected the next time. Each repetition made it heavier, as if the syllables themselves were being reshaped to fit a narrative she had not agreed to. Louis Johnson was no longer a researcher. She was a question mark. Charles noticed before she said anything. He always did. The shift in his posture, the way his phone began to buzz more often, conversations dropping into silence the moment she entered a room. He moved quickly, decisively, as he always had when something threatened what he cared about. He called people, made requests that sounded like favors, but carried the weight of expectation. Articles softened. Photos disappeared. A publicist was assigned without consultation. Security increased around her building, unmarked but unmistakable. To Charles, it was protection. To Louis, it was enclosure. She felt it most acutely the first time she was asked to exit through a side door. The suggestion came gently, almost apologetically. But the implication was clear. Visibility was a liability now. Hers. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly as they sat in his car, the city sliding past behind tinted glass. "I know," Charles replied. "That's why I'm handling it." The word struck her harder than he intended. Handling. As if she were a situation rather than a person. The tension built slowly, accumulating in moments too small to confront individually. A dinner canceled because cameras had been spotted. A meeting rescheduled because it wasn't the right time. A casual hand placed at the small of her back, guiding rather than touching. She tried to explain. He tried to reassure. Neither listened as closely as they should have. The argument came late one evening, unplanned and uncontained. It started with a single question. "Do you trust me?" Louis asked. Charles answered immediately. "Of course." "Then stop making decisions for me." He frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "I'm not making decisions. I'm minimizing risk." For whom she challenged. "Me or you?" Silence fell between them, dense and dangerous. "I'm trying to keep you safe," he said finally. Louis shook her head. "I don't need to be kept. I need to be respected." The word landed between them like a fracture. Charles spoke about consequences, about how quickly the world could turn, about the cost of exposure. Louis spoke about autonomy, about the violence of being erased in the name of protection. Their voices never rose, but the distance widened with every sentence. "You don't understand what this world does to people it can't control," Charles said. "And you don't understand what it feels like to be controlled by someone you care about." Louis replied. The truth sat raw and unyielding between them. When she left that night, She did so without drama. She gathered her coat. She met his eyes once, searching for something she couldn't name, then turned away. "I won't disappear for your convenience," she said softly, "even if it costs me you." Charles didn't follow. He stood alone in the apartment long after the door closed. Surrounded by silence, he had never learned to negotiate. His phone lay untouched. For the first time, there was no number he could call to fix what had broken. Louis walked into the night unprotected, unhidden, her steps steady despite the ache settling deep in her chest. She didn't look back. Not because it didn't hurt, but because looking back had never saved anyone. By morning, the city would move on. The headlines would find new angles. The world would continue to orbit power, as it always had. But Charles Blackwood would wake to a truth no amount of money could soften. Love, when mistaken for possession, became its own kind of danger. Louis's life did not collapse after she left Charles. It narrowed, sharpened, then expanded in a way she hadn't anticipated. The first weeks were the hardest, not because of loneliness, but because of silence. There were no carefully timed messages, no quiet presence filling space without demanding it. The absence of him pressed in during moments that had once been shared late evenings, when her thoughts ran long, early mornings when the city felt too awake for how tired she was. She allowed herself exactly 3 nights of grief, 3 nights to sit with the ache, to acknowledge what had been lost without romanticizing it into something sacred. On the 4th morning, she returned to work. She threw herself into her research with a precision that surprised even her colleagues. The project, once stalled by committees and hesitation, moved forward under her direction with renewed clarity. She spoke at conferences not as a rising voice to be watched, but as a force already in motion. Her arguments were sharp, her data unassailable. When questions came, she answered without apology or deflection. The room listened. Gradually, her name began to circulate again, but this time, it carried weight. Not as an association, not as a curiosity, as authority. Louis Johnson became known for her work, not her proximity. Invitations arrived addressed solely to her. Panels sought her perspective. Journals published her findings without editorial hesitation. She stood on stages beneath bright lights, fielding applause that felt earned rather than inherited. There were moments, brief and human, when she wondered if Charles saw the headlines now, if he recognized the distance between the woman the media had tried to frame and the one she had insisted on becoming. But she did not dwell on it. She had learned the cost of looking backward. She was not angry anymore. Anger required energy she needed elsewhere. She was free. Charles, meanwhile, discovered that success without meaning was a quieter kind of ruin. From the outside, nothing had changed. His companies expanded. His investments outperformed expectations. He closed deals that left rivals scrambling to recover. The board praised his decisiveness. The press celebrated his discipline. He was, by every measurable standard, winning. But his days lost their edges. Meetings blurred together. Conversations felt repetitive, rehearsed. He spoke more than he listened, not out of arrogance, but out of fatigue. The city he once dominated began to feel smaller, its rhythms predictable, its rewards hollow. At night, he returned to apartments too large for one person. He slept poorly, waking before dawn without reason. He found himself replaying conversations, not because of strategy, but because of regret. He wondered, not for the first time, whether control had become his default language because it spared him the vulnerability of choice. Louis's absence followed him everywhere. She existed in the quiet pauses between calls, in the empty chair across from him at dinner, in the way silence now felt accusatory rather than neutral. He had never believed in emotional dependency. He had built his life to be immune to it. Yet here he was, undone, not by loss, but by the knowledge that the loss was self-inflicted. The revelation came without drama, a routine review, a file buried beneath years of documentation, a name he had long associated with loyalty rather than manipulation. Evelyn. He noticed the discrepancies first, minor redirections in funding, strategic delays framed as caution, communications rerouted before reaching him. Each instance alone was insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. He followed it slowly, methodically, resisting the urge to jump to conclusions. The truth revealed itself, not as betrayal, but as orchestration. Evelyn had not acted against him. She had acted for him, or rather, for the version of him she believed should exist. She had filtered information, positioned narratives, created distance where closeness threatened balance. She had framed Louis as a liability, not through accusation, but through omission, small suggestions, planted early, allowed to grow unchecked. By the time Charles understood the scope of it, the damage had already been done. He confronted Evelyn without theatrics. There was no shouting, no raised voices, just a conversation stripped of illusions. "You decided for me," he said, the words flat, precise. "I protected you," she replied calmly. "From distraction, from weakness." Charles shook his head slowly. "You protected an image." She met his gaze without flinching. "That image built everything you have, and cost me the one thing I didn't know I needed," he said. Evelyn's silence was confirmation enough. For the first time, Charles felt something close to grief, not for the relationship he had lost, but for the choices he had deferred. He had allowed others to curate his reality, believing it efficiency rather than avoidance. He had mistaken insulation for strength. The regret settled deep, heavy and unavoidable. He did not seek Louis out immediately. He understood. Now, the violence of intrusion masked as concern. He watched from a distance as her career flourished, resisting the instinct to intervene, to insert himself back into her world simply because he missed her. Instead, he began dismantling the structures that had enabled the deception. He severed ties quietly, reclaimed oversight he had once delegated, rebuilt his inner circle with ruthless honesty. It cost him allies. It cost him ease. It gave him clarity. Months passed. Louis thrived. She moved into a new apartment, smaller but filled with light. She surrounded herself with people who challenged her without attempting to shape her. She dated occasionally, briefly, never seriously. Not because she was waiting, but because she refused to settle into patterns that felt familiar rather than right. Charles remained present in her thoughts only as a lesson, until one evening, after a lecture that ended in a standing ovation, she received an email she did not expect. It was short, direct, unadorned. No explanations, no requests, just the truth. She read it twice before closing her laptop. The city reflected in the darkened screen. Her heart did not race. Her breath did not catch. Instead, a slow, measured understanding settled over her. So that was it. Charles Blackwood, for all his power, had finally chosen honesty. She did not respond immediately. She didn't need to. The knowledge was enough for now. For Charles. The act of telling her felt like both absolution and risk. He had no expectations, no assumptions. He understood. Finally. That choice was something granted, not taken. And somewhere between her independence and his reckoning, the space between them shifted not toward reunion, not yet, but toward possibility. The world without him had made Louis stronger. The world without her had made Charles human. Whether those truths could coexist remained uncertain. But for the first time, neither of them was hiding from the answer. Charles waited longer than instinct demanded, and shorter than fear suggested. The space between restraint and regret had become familiar territory, and he navigated it carefully now, aware that urgency had once been his most destructive habit. He did not arrive with an entourage. No driver waited at the curb. No assistant hovered with contingencies prepared. He came alone, walking the last block to Louis's building as if distance might soften what he carried. Louis saw him from the window before he buzzed. She had learned, over months of independence, to recognize patterns without assigning meaning to them. Charles Blackwood, standing on the sidewalk below, did not disrupt her pulse the way it once might have. The sight registered, settled, waited. She let him in. They did not embrace. They did not pretend familiarity. They stood across from each other in her living room, the city breathing steadily beyond the glass. The room reflected her now, books stacked without concern for symmetry, light filtering in unobstructed, a quiet sense of ownership in every detail. "You came," she said, not as invitation or accusation, just fact. "I needed to," Charles replied, without asking for anything. She gestured for him to sit. He remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, then followed her lead. Silence stretched, not uncomfortable but deliberate. Louis had grown skilled at letting people reveal themselves when they believed they were being evaluated. Charles understood that. Now, he didn't rush. "I owe you the truth," he said finally. "All of it. Not as an explanation, as accountability." She nodded once. "Then tell it that way." Charles spoke slowly, choosing precision over persuasion. He told her about Evelyn, not as a villain, but as an architect of assumptions he had accepted without interrogation. He described the systems he had built to protect efficiency, the autonomy he had surrendered in the name of control. He admitted how easily he had mistaken insulation for safety, and how often he had allowed others to curate reality on his behalf. "I believed I was protecting you," he said, "by minimizing exposure, by managing outcomes. What I didn't understand was that protection without consent is just another form of harm." Louis listened without interrupting. Her expression remained composed, but her attention sharpened. This was not the defensive man she had left. This was someone speaking without armor. He continued, recounting the decisions that had shaped her career in subtle ways. funding approvals redirected to preserve her independence, committees influenced to keep her research from being diluted by commercial pressure, opportunities shielded from political interference. "I never wanted you to owe me," he said. "So I made sure you didn't know." The words settled between them, heavy and complicated. Louis leaned back, absorbing the implications. She felt no surge of gratitude, no immediate softening. What she felt was clarity. "You decided for me," she said quietly. "Again." "Yes," Charles replied. "And I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm telling you because you deserved to know then, and you deserve to know now." She studied him, seeing the cost in his posture, the restraint in his voice. This was not a confession seeking absolution. It was an offering with no guarantee of acceptance. "You don't get credit for protecting something you didn't have permission to touch," she said. "Even if the outcome was good." "I know," he said. "I learned that too late." The admission carried no self-pity, just acknowledgement. Louis stood and walked toward the window, giving herself space to think. The city below pulsed with its familiar indifference. She had learned to thrive within it, on her own terms. "You understand why I left," she said, not turning back. "Yes." "And why I might not come back." "Yes." She faced him again. "Then why are you here?" Charles met her gaze steadily. "Because I don't want the truth to be another thing you discover by accident." That, more than anything, shifted something. They talked for hours after that, not about the past in exhaustive detail, but about what came after it. Louis spoke of the way she had rebuilt her life, the boundaries she now guarded fiercely. Charles listened without interrupting, without attempting to insert himself into narratives that were no longer his to shape. He asked questions, but only when invited. He offered answers, but only when requested. When the conversation turned quiet, it did so naturally. "You changed," Louis said eventually. "So did you." "Yes." She agreed. "I had to." The weight of that truth settled gently between them. When Charles stood to leave, there was no dramatic pause, no plea. He gathered his coat, nodded once. "Thank you for hearing me," he said. Louis walked him to the door. As he reached for the handle, she spoke again. "You did protect my work," she said. "That matters. But it doesn't erase what it cost." "I wouldn't expect it to," he replied. She opened the door, hesitated, then added, "Trust doesn't return all at once. It rebuilds in fragments. I'll take any fragment you're willing to give," he said. Even silence. After he left, Louis stood alone in the doorway longer than she realized. The conversation replayed, not as confrontation, but as recalibration. She felt no rush to redefine what they were or might become. What she felt was something quieter. Respect. Not the performative kind, offered in rooms full of witnesses, but the private kind that acknowledged agency, even when it complicated desire. Trust, she knew, was not an emotion. It was a practice. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Charles walked back into the city without direction. The tension he had carried for months finally easing into something manageable. He had told the truth without attempting to control its reception. Whatever followed would not be engineered. for two people accustomed to navigating power. That surrender felt radical, and somewhere between the honesty that cost him everything and the independence that had saved her, a fragile understanding took root. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the possibility of it real, unforced, and finally earned. They did not announce their return to each other. There was no declaration, no moment that could be traced and replayed. Their reconnection happened the way trust rebuilt itself quietly. Through repetition, dinners without spectacle, conversations that extended beyond comfort, silences that no longer needed defending. It was not passion that brought them back into orbit, but alignment. They had learned the cost of standing apart. They chose, carefully, to stand closer. The world noticed immediately. Markets reacted before people did. A sudden shift in investor confidence. Anonymous reports surfaced, precise and damaging, questioning Charles's leadership, his judgment, the stability of his inner circle. The stock dipped, then slid, then faltered under the weight of speculation, sharpened into certainty. Analysts spoke in careful tones that masked eagerness. Rivals moved quickly, sensing blood in the water. Charles recognized the pattern. This was not coincidence. This was orchestration. The threats arrived soon after. At first, they were indirect emails that hinted rather than accused, calls that dropped before voices could be traced. Then they sharpened. Messages sent to Lewis's office, to her phone. Language designed not to terrify, but to unbalance, to remind her that proximity carried consequence. Charles reacted the way he always had when danger approached. He assessed, calculated, prepared contingencies. He arranged security without discussion. He suggested, gently at first, then with growing urgency, that Lewis step away, travel, disappear until the storm passed. "You don't belong in this," he said one night, tension tight in his voice. "This is my war." Lewis looked at him steadily. "It became mine the moment they decided I was leverage. That's exactly why you should leave." She shook her head. "That's exactly why I won't." The refusal was calm, absolute. Charles felt the old instinct rise, the need to shield, to remove variables, to restore control. He recognized it now for what it was, fear disguised as protection. "You could get hurt," he said quietly. "So could you," Lewis replied. "But you don't see me asking you to step aside." The truth settled between them, unyielding. For the first time, Charles understood that standing together did not mean positioning her behind him. It meant letting her stand where she chose beside him, visible and unhidden. The first public appearance was deliberate, a conference on innovation and ethics. Scheduled months earlier, Charles had planned to attend alone. He altered the plan without announcement. Lewis arrived with him, not as accompaniment, but as a featured speaker. Cameras pivoted instantly. Whispers surged. Questions sharpened. Lewis took the stage without hesitation. She spoke not about him, not about controversy, but about her work, about integrity in systems designed to erode it, about accountability that extended beyond performance. Her voice was steady, her presence unassailable. The room listened. Charles watched from the audience, understanding the risk she was taking. Every word placed her further into the line of fire. Every sentence reclaimed narrative. When questions turned invasive, she redirected them with surgical precision. When implications surfaced, she dismantled them without defensiveness. She did not deny her connection to Charles. She contextualized it. "I don't need protection from association," she said calmly. "I need space to be evaluated on my own merit." The statement rippled outward, reframing the discourse before it could harden. The backlash intensified. Stock volatility worsened. Anonymous sources leaked half-truths. Old alliances resurfaced with selective memory. Charles's opponents moved openly now, emboldened by momentum. Meetings grew colder. Allies wavered. At night, the threats became more explicit. Charles increased security again, this time with Lewis's knowledge. She accepted the measures without surrendering autonomy. She adjusted routines, documented incidents, prepared contingencies of her own. They argued less than expected. The pressure refined them, rather than fractured them. Each decision was discussed. Each disagreement surfaced early, resolved without escalation. They learned the rhythm of crisis together, not as commander and protected asset, but as partners navigating exposure. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, Charles returned to find Lewis seated at the kitchen table, papers spread before her. "I've been thinking," she said. "They're not just attacking you. They're attacking the idea that your power can coexist with accountability." He sat across from her, exhaustion etched deep. "They're afraid of precedent." "Yes," she said. "So let's give them one." The plan was risky, transparent to the point of vulnerability. Charles would open portions of the company's governance structure to external review, not as concession, but as declaration. Lewis would lead an independent advisory panel, insulated from corporate influence by design. It was the opposite of damage control. It was exposure. Charles understood the implications immediately. "They'll call it weakness. They already are." Lewis replied, "This changes the language." The announcement landed like a shockwave. Markets reeled. Commentators scrambled. Critics sharpened knives. But something else happened too. Confidence stabilized. Quietly at first, then with momentum. Investors recalibrated. Public perception shifted from scandal to scrutiny. The threats did not vanish. They escalated, then fractured under the weight of daylight. The final confrontation came without warning. A public accusation, timed for maximum impact. A press conference designed to corner, to force reaction. Charles stood at the podium, Lewis beside him, not touching, but aligned. Questions flew. Voices rose. Charles answered when necessary, deferred when appropriate. Then Louis spoke. She did not defend him. She contextualized the attack. She dismantled its premise with evidence, clarity, and restraint. She spoke of systems, not individuals, of responsibility shared rather than centralized. By the time the conference ended, the narrative had shifted again, not resolved, but redirected. That night, as they stood on the balcony of his apartment, the city stretched endlessly before them. Sirens wailed in the distance. The air was cool, sharp with possibility. "I tried to send you away," Charles said quietly. "I know," Lewis replied. "You were afraid." "Yes." She turned to him. "So was I." but fear doesn't get to decide anymore. He nodded, the admission settling deep. Thank you for staying. She considered him for a long moment. I didn't stay for you, she said gently. I stayed for myself. You just happened to be where I chose to stand. The distinction mattered. They stood together, not untouched by the fire, but unbroken by it. The world would continue to test them. Power always invited challenge. Love always invited consequence. But for the first time, they faced both without retreat, not shielded, not hidden, together. The invitation did not come from Charles. That detail mattered. It arrived on Louis's desk, early in the morning. Formal and unmistakable, a request for her to address the media directly, not as a companion, not as context, as a voice. The phrasing was careful, but the intention was clear. The narrative had reached a point where silence would be interpreted as concession. Louis read it once, then set it aside. She didn't consult Charles immediately, not because she didn't value his opinion, but because this decision belonged to her. For weeks, she had been spoken about, framed, reduced, interpreted. Every angle had been explored, except the one that mattered most, her own. By noon, she had accepted. The room was not large, but it was dense with attention. Journalists lined the walls, devices poised, expressions sharpened by anticipation. This was not a neutral gathering. This was a test, staged to see whether she would flinch, deflect, or defer. Louis walked in alone. No hand on her back, no protective proximity. She took her seat at the table, placed her notes neatly in front of her, and looked up. The murmuring quieted. Cameras clicked, then stilled. She waited not because she was unsure, but because she understood the power of timing. When she spoke, her voice was calm, not softened, not raised. I'm here because my name has been used in conversations where my voice was absent. She began. That ends today. There was no preamble, no apology for taking up space. Questions followed quickly, some sharp, some thinly veiled attempts at provocation. Louis answered each with precision. When asked about Charles, she contextualized him without centering him. When asked about influence, she spoke about agency. When asked about risk, she reframed it as responsibility. I don't exist in proximity to power, she said evenly. I exist on my own merit. Any assumption otherwise says more about the system making it than about me. The room shifted. She did not deny her relationship with Charles. She refused to let it define her. She acknowledged scrutiny without submitting to it. She spoke of her work with clarity that left no room for dismissal. She named the discomfort others felt without validating it. I will not apologize for being visible, she said, and I will not perform smallness to make others comfortable. Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the kind that comes when a premise collapses. The coverage that followed was immediate and uncontainable. Headlines recalibrated. Language changed. Commentators hesitated, recalculating positions previously held with confidence. What had been framed as vulnerability was suddenly legible as strength. Charles watched from a distance, as he had promised himself he would. Not because he lacked concern, but because he trusted her. That trust was no longer theoretical. It was earned, reinforced, undeniable. He saw it then, not in the applause or the analysis, but in the stillness that followed. The elite circles that had once dismissed her fell quiet, unsure how to respond to a woman who neither sought permission nor demanded validation. She had shifted the axis. That night, when they met, it was not celebratory. There were no raised glasses, no relief masquerading as victory. They sat together in the quiet of his apartment, the city pulsing beyond the windows. "You didn't need me there," Charles said. Louis smiled faintly. "I didn't want you there." He nodded, understanding the distinction. "You were formidable." She considered the word. "I was honest." The attacks did not stop overnight. Power rarely surrendered without resistance. But their shape changed. The language softened. The insinuations lost traction. The threats became less frequent, less confident. What remained was respect, reluctant. Perhaps, but unavoidable. Charles felt the transformation within himself just as acutely. For years, he had believed strength required containment. That exposure was liability. That the safest way to love was to shield. Louis dismantled that belief without confrontation. She did not weaken his position. She clarified it. Where others had seen risk, he now saw alignment. Where he had once anticipated loss, he recognized growth. The presence he had feared would be used against him had instead become a stabilizing force. She was not the crack in his armor. She was the reason he no longer needed it. The final test came quietly, as they often did. A private meeting, an offer wrapped in concession, a chance to restore equilibrium by stepping back into familiar patterns. Charles listened without interruption, then declined. "We're not reverting," he said simply. "This is the direction." The decision cost him. It always would have. But it cost him less than compromise would have. Later, as they stood together on the balcony, the city stretched endlessly before them, unbothered by the recalibration of power happening quietly above it. "They're afraid of you," Charles said, not with pride, but with recognition. Louis looked out over the lights. "They're afraid of what they can't categorize." He turned to her. "You changed everything." She met his gaze. "No. I clarified it." They stood in silence. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because nothing needed to be defended. The fire had tested them, stripped away illusion, exposed fault lines, and reinforced foundations. Louis had not survived the pressure by disappearing. She had met it head on. And Charles, watching her stand unyielding in a world that had underestimated her, understood something fundamental at last. She had never been his weakness. She was his equal. And in a world built on imbalance, that was the most dangerous strength of all. After the noise faded, what remained was not peace, but clarity. The media moved on, as it always did. The market stabilized into a cautious rhythm. Public outrage diluted into analysis, then into abstraction. From the outside, it appeared as though the storm had passed. But for Charles and Louis, the quiet that followed carried weight. This was the part no one warned you about, the moment when survival was no longer the goal, and meaning demanded definition. They did not rush it. Days passed without urgency. They worked separately, deliberately, resisting the old impulse to fuse lives simply because the world had tried to tear them apart. Louis returned to her routines with renewed focus. Her calendar filled with commitments that reflected choice rather than reaction. Charles reorganized what remained unsettled, not to consolidate power, but to simplify it. They met in the evenings when time allowed, not out of necessity, but intention. It was during one of those evenings, unremarkable and quiet, that Charles finally spoke what had been gathering shape for weeks. "I'm stepping back," he said. Louis looked up from the book she was reading, attentive but unstartled. "From what? From being the center of everything," he replied. "From needing control to justify relevance." She waited. He had learned that waiting was not absence. It was respect. "I won't disappear," he continued. "But I won't lead the way I used to. Not anymore." Louis closed the book, setting it aside. "And what does that mean for us?" Charles met her gaze steadily. "It means I won't ask you to fit into a life designed without you. If we do this, it's because it aligns, not because it survives." The words mattered, not because they promised permanence, but because they refused possession. Louis considered the truth beneath them. She had spent months reclaiming authorship of her life. Any future she allowed into it would have to earn its place not through intensity, but coherence. "I won't be an anchor," she said slowly, "and I won't be a shield. I don't want either." Charles replied, "I want a witness, and if I'm worthy of it, your partner." The distinction settled between them, precise and rare. Outside, the city moved without regard for their reckoning. Inside, something irreversible took shape. The final challenge did not arrive as threat or scandal. It came as opportunity. A merger proposal surfaced quietly, engineered to restore absolute dominance. The terms were flawless, the outcome guaranteed. Accepting it would secure Charles's legacy in the language the world understood: best numbers, reach, permanence. Declining it would leave questions unanswered, narratives unresolved. The board urged acceptance. Advisors spoke of timing, momentum, inevitability. Charles listened. Then he declined. The decision shocked those who had mistaken recalibration for retreat. It was not martyrdom. It was authorship. He refused to build a future that erased the growth he had earned. Louis watched from the periphery, not intervening, not guiding. She understood now that trust did not require proximity to influence. The backlash was muted, confused by the lack of drama. The world denied spectacle, lost interest. That night, they walked through the city together without destination. No security detail, no cameras, just the rhythm of shared steps and unclaimed space. "You could have had everything," Louis said. Charles smiled faintly. "I already do." She stopped walking, turned to him. "Say it clearly." He did. "I have a life that finally feels honest." She studied him, seeing not the man he had been, but the one he had chosen to become. The difference was subtle. It was also everything. "I won't promise forever," she said. "I don't believe in guarantees." "I don't need one," Charles replied. "I need now, and the chance to choose it again tomorrow." They stood beneath a streetlight, the city breathing around them. No declaration followed. No kiss sealed the moment. What passed between them was quieter and more durable. Decision. In the days that followed, preparations unfolded not for escape, but for intention. Louis accepted a fellowship that would take her abroad for several months. Charles encouraged it without hesitation, without framing distance as loss. They planned visits when possible, not as obligation, but as anticipation. There were moments of doubt, brief and human. There always were, but doubt no longer dictated direction. On the eve of Louis's departure, they shared dinner at her apartment. The space felt lived in now, grounded. Charles stood at the window afterward, watching the city that had once defined him. "You're not afraid," he observed. "I was," Louis replied. But fear stopped being useful. He nodded. "I don't want to be a chapter you outgrow." She stepped closer. "Not touching." "Then don't be." The simplicity of it landed with force. Later, alone. Charles understood the truth that had taken him a lifetime to reach love did not require sacrifice of self. It required alignment with it. As Louis packed the last of her belongings, she paused, reflecting on the arc that had brought her here. She had not been saved. She had not been claimed. She had been met, and that made all the difference. They parted the next morning without spectacle. No promises spoken aloud. No fear left behind. Just two people moving forward. Not away from each other, but toward the lives they had chosen. The ending had not yet arrived, but the shape of it steady, earned. Unafraid was finally visible. What came next would not be survival. It would be home. The reunion did not happen at an airport. There were no rushing footsteps, no last-minute realizations delivered breathlessly beneath departure boards. Life had taught them both that love built on urgency rarely survived stillness. So, when Louis returned, months later, it was without ceremony. A scheduled flight, a quiet arrival, a message sent after landing. Simple and unadorned. "I'm home." Charles read it while standing in his kitchen, morning light stretching across the floor. The word home did not imply him. That, he understood now, was precisely why it mattered. They met that evening at a small restaurant neither of them had ever tried before. No press, no security, no expectations. The city hummed beyond the windows, unchanged and indifferent. Louis looked different subtly, decisively. Not transformed, but settled. The confidence she carried now was not sharpened by resistance. It was rooted. "So," Charles said after a moment, the familiar ease returning without effort. "How was the world without me?" She smiled. "Larger than I expected. Kinder, too." He nodded. "I'm glad." They spoke of her work first, as they always did now, of discoveries made and questions left open, of collaborations that respected her pace. When she asked about him, he spoke not of profits or power, but of restructuring, of learning to delegate without disappearing, of choosing presence over performance. There was no accounting, no tally of sacrifices made or distances crossed. What they shared now did not require justification. When they left, the night was cool, the air sharp with the promise of change. They walked without destination, as they had before. But this time, the steps felt anchored rather than exploratory. at the corner where they paused. Louis stopped. "I'm not looking for permanence," she said. "Not as warning, but as truth. I'm looking for partnership that evolves." Charles met her gaze, then let it. The months that followed were unremarkable in the way that mattered most. There were mornings that began slowly, dinners that stretched long without agenda, disagreements navigated without escalation, space honored without distance weaponized. They did not merge lives. They aligned them. Louis accepted a permanent role that allowed her to move between cities, between ideas, without surrendering autonomy. Charles continued to lead, but differently now, less as a figurehead, more as a steward. He no longer equated visibility with relevance. He no longer needed to dominate space to justify his place in it. They appeared together publicly when it served purpose, not optics, when they didn't. No explanation followed. The world learned, slowly, that access was no longer guaranteed. One evening, after a long day, Charles came home to find Louis on the balcony. The city spread before her like a living map. "I used to think love was something you protected," he said, joining her. And now she asked, "Now I think it's something you trust." She turned to him, considering. "That's harder." "Yes," he agreed. "But it lasts longer." The proposal, when it came, was unplanned and undramatic. They were in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The windows were open. Music played softly. Charles paused, knife in hand, as if struck by a thought that refused to be postponed. "I don't want a future where I choose you once," he said. "I want one where I choose you repeatedly." Louis didn't answer immediately. She finished slicing the vegetables, set the knife aside, then faced him. "I won't be someone's reward," she said. "I know." Charles replied, "I'm asking you to be my choice." The silence that followed was not suspenseful. It was reflective. "Yes," she said finally, "on one condition. Name it. We keep choosing ourselves." 2. He smiled, relief and clarity merging seamlessly. Always. They married quietly. No spectacle. No guest list designed to impress. Just a small gathering of people who knew them as they were, not as they had been portrayed. Louis wore a dress that moved when she did. Charles looked lighter than he ever had in tailored black. When they exchanged vows, there were no promises of rescue or completion, only commitments to honesty, to respect, to continued authorship of individual lives woven together by consent. In the years that followed, their story was occasionally referenced, misinterpreted, reduced to narrative convenience. The world preferred myths to nuance. They didn't correct it. They lived instead. Louis's work reshaped conversations that mattered. Charles's leadership became quieter, more effective. Together, they built a life defined not by survival or defiance, but by intentional joy. On a quiet morning, years later, they stood together in the kitchen as light filtered through the windows, familiar and unremarkable. "This," Louis said, gesturing around them, "is what they never predicted." Charles laughed softly. "They were looking for weakness and found strength." She replied. He reached for her hand, not to hold her in place, but to walk with her toward whatever came next. She had never been saved. He had never been redeemed. They had chosen each other, and in that choice made freely, repeatedly. Without fear, they had found something far rarer than a happy ending. They had found home.